It was a late evening, and Anna had just wrapped up a long day at work. She'd been putting in extra hours and was exhausted. The city streets, usually bustling with energy, were now eerily quiet, save for the occasional sound of a passing car. The streets were familiar, yet something about the night felt off. She called a taxi, as she didn't feel like walking the few blocks home. After a short wait, the car pulled up. It wasn't the usual cab, though. This one had dark-tinted windows, the kind that made it hard to see inside. The driver's face was shadowed, his features difficult to make out in the dim street lights. Without much thought, Anna got in. She'd been taking taxis for years and never had a second thought about it. But tonight, her instincts were telling her something was wrong. She brushed it off, chalking it up to the stress of her day. "Where to?" The driver's voice came from the front, low and emotionless. "Just take me to the center, please," Anna replied, giving her address without hesitation. As the taxi pulled away, Anna noticed how empty the streets were. She couldn't remember the last time she had seen the city so quiet. There were no other cars, no pedestrians, just silence stretching out around them. The driver seemed to be taking a longer route than usual, but Anna wasn't sure. She was too tired to pay much attention. A few minutes into the ride, Anna glanced at her phone. The time was ticking, but something didn't feel right. The streetlights outside seemed to flicker, casting strange shadows that seemed to linger a bit too long. She felt a chill, despite the warmth of the car. The air felt dense, heavy. "Are we almost there?" Anna asked, trying to break the silence. "Just a little longer," the driver answered, his voice still monotonous. The further they went, the more isolated the streets became. Anna had never noticed how unfamiliar the surroundings were. The buildings were older, abandoned-looking, and the road was less well-maintained. Her gut tightened with unease. "Excuse me, why are we heading this way?" Anna finally asked, her voice shaky. The driver didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned the corner into a narrow alley that she had never seen before. The car was now moving through darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the taxi's headlights. Anna's heart started racing, and she looked around, realizing they were far from any well-lit street. There was no sign of life. No other cars. No people. "Where are we?" she demanded, more firmly now. The driver still didn't answer. Instead, he stopped the car. The engine hummed, and the eerie silence enveloped them. "Get out," the driver finally said, his voice no longer emotionless, but cold, with an edge of something that felt far too menacing. Anna's heart thudded in her chest. The panic set in as she realized something was horribly wrong. I'll just get out here," she stammered, reaching for the door handle, but the car was locked. She tried again, tugging at the door with increasing force, but it wouldn't budge. She turned to the driver, but his face remained hidden in the shadows. The only thing she could make out were his eyes, cold, dark, and unblinking. There was a weight in the air, a tension she could feel in her bones. The car felt like it had become a cage, and she was trapped inside. She tried to stay calm, remembering her self-defense classes. But the words were stuck in her throat. Something told her to stay quiet, to do nothing that might provoke him. She began to fear that if she made the wrong move, it would be the last thing she ever did. Without warning, the driver spoke again, his voice sending a chill down her spine. "You should never have gotten in." Suddenly, the car jolted forward. Anna's hands gripped the seat, her body bracing for whatever was coming. Her mind raced. Had he been following her? Was this some kind of sick game? She could feel her chest tightening with fear. She glanced at the rearview mirror, searching for any sign of hope, but it was all darkness. No one else was on the road. Nothing seemed real anymore. Just the sound of the engine and her frantic heartbeat. "Please, let me out," Anna begged, her voice barely a whisper. For a moment, there was silence. The driver didn't respond, and for a second, Anna thought he might have heard the fear in her voice. But then, the car sped up, as if to drown out her plea. Suddenly, they turned onto an empty street. The building in front of them looked like a warehouse, old and abandoned. The air grew colder, and Anna could see her breath fogging up in the air. The car stopped. The driver turned off the engine, and the silence returned. Before she could react, the door swung open. A hand, rough and cold, reached inside and yanked her out of the car. Anna screamed, but it was swallowed up by the night. As she struggled, she could see the driver now, his face finally visible in the dim light. It wasn't a face at all. It was something twisted, barely human. His skin was pale and stretched too thin, his eyes hollow and sunken. The hand that gripped her arm felt like ice, and she realized she couldn't move, couldn't speak. "Why are you doing this?" Anna managed to whisper, her throat dry. The figure leaned in, its face so close she could feel its cold breath. "You never should have gotten in," it repeated, its voice now a low growl. In that moment, Anna's mind screamed, telling her to run, to fight, but she was paralyzed with fear. She couldn't remember how she had gotten here, how she had ended up in this nightmare. All she knew was that she needed to survive. A distant noise broke the tension, the sound of a car approaching. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, and the figure backed away, retreating into the shadows. Without saying a word, Anna ran toward the light, her legs finally moving again. The taxi disappeared into the night, leaving no trace behind. Anna never took a taxi again. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still hear the driver's voice, "You should never have gotten in." It was already past midnight when James hailed the cab. He had been at a work event that ran longer than expected, and now he just wanted to get home. The cold air of the city at night felt different, crisp and unsettling, and the streetlights cast long, strange shadows. He shrugged it off, blaming the fatigue from the evening. The cab pulled up, an old model with faded paint and a slight dent in the front fender. The driver was a middle-aged man with unkempt hair and a tired face. His eyes seemed distant, as though he hadn't slept in days. James hesitated for just a moment but dismissed the thought, stepping into the back seat. "Where to?" the driver asked, his voice hoarse, almost as if it hadn't been used in hours. "Just take me to Fifth Avenue, please," James replied, trying to sound calm. The driver nodded and pulled away, the tires scraping against the rough pavement. The city, which was usually alive with the sounds of cars and people, seemed almost too quiet now. The usual hum of the night seemed muffled, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The journey started uneventfully, but as they drove deeper into the quieter part of the city, James started to notice something odd. The driver wasn't taking the usual route. The streets seemed unfamiliar, and they passed by dark alleys and old buildings James couldn't place. Every turn felt wrong, as though they were moving further and further from his intended destination. "Hey, I think you missed the turn," James said, trying to keep his voice steady. The driver didn't respond, only gripped the wheel tighter and continued driving, the car picking up speed. The streetlights outside flickered, casting strange shadows across the dashboard. "Excuse me," James said again, his voice now tinged with concern. "Where are we going?" This time, the driver spoke, but his voice was low, almost whispering. "You've been here before." James froze. "What do you mean?" The car swerved suddenly, and James gripped the seat in surprise. They were now in a part of the city he didn't recognize at all. The buildings looked abandoned, their windows shattered, and the streets were empty. The faint glow of a broken streetlight was the only source of illumination. He could see an old, crumbling building in the distance, its facade barely standing. "Stop the car," James demanded, his voice shaky now. "I want to get out." But the driver didn't stop. Instead, he kept his eyes focused on the road ahead, muttering under his breath in a language James couldn't understand. The air in the car grew thick, heavy, as if the very atmosphere had changed. A coldness crept over him, and his skin prickled with unease. "Why are we here?" James asked, feeling the dread settle in his stomach. The driver didn't answer. He turned down another narrow street, so tight that the car almost scraped the sides of the buildings. The tires screeched as they turned, and James thought he could hear distant whispers, like a voice calling his name. But when he looked out the window, there was no one in sight. A strange, almost imperceptible hum filled the car, vibrating through the seats, making James feel like he was sinking into the floor. His heart pounded in his chest. Suddenly, the driver spoke again, his voice now a rasping hiss. "You don't remember, do you?" James felt a chill run down his spine. "Remember what?" "Your last ride," the driver whispered. "The one that ended here." James' mind raced, but he couldn't recall anything about a past ride. His last memory was of leaving the event, of getting into this cab. He had no idea what the driver was talking about, but something about the way the words echoed in his mind made him feel like he was losing his grip on reality. The car came to a stop in front of the dilapidated building. The driver didn't speak again. Instead, he turned off the engine, and the eerie silence returned. The hum had stopped, but the air inside the car felt thick, suffocating. "Get out," the driver said flatly, his voice now completely void of emotion. James didn't move at first, his mind still reeling. Something was horribly wrong. He had to leave, but his legs felt heavy, as though they were glued to the seat. His eyes darted to the door, but he couldn't bring himself to reach for the handle. There was something in the air, something he couldn't explain, but it was making it impossible for him to act. Then, as if in a trance, he unbuckled his seatbelt and slowly opened the door. The moment his foot hit the pavement, the street seemed to close in around him. The building loomed before him, its windows dark and hollow, like empty eyes staring at him. James turned back to the car, but it was already gone. The cab had vanished into the night, without a sound. He stood there, frozen, as a voice whispered from the shadows. "You've always been here." James didn't know how long he stood there, paralyzed by fear. The air grew colder, and the city around him felt unreal, like a place that didn't belong in time. Slowly, he turned and walked toward the abandoned building, unsure of what he was doing, but feeling as though he had no other choice. His steps echoed in the silence, and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. When he reached the door, he hesitated for just a moment before pushing it open. Inside, everything was just as empty as the outside, but there was something about it that felt familiar. And then it hit him. This was the same building where he had been before. He remembered now, his previous ride, years ago, had ended here. But how? Why had he forgotten? The memories flooded back, and he realized that he had never left. He had been trapped in this place all along. As he stepped further inside, the door slammed shut behind him. And somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of a car engine starting up echoed through the emptiness. It was just after midnight when Tom decided to take a cab home. He had stayed late at the office, working on a project that had stretched into the night. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He had missed several calls from his wife, but he didn't feel like explaining why he was so late. The streets of the city were empty, save for the occasional passing car. The air was chilly, and the occasional gust of wind rattled the leaves in the trees. Tom stood on the sidewalk, hailing a cab. He was too tired to walk the 20 minutes back home, and besides, a cab would be faster. A black sedan rolled up to him, its headlights cutting through the dark. The window lowered, and the driver, an older man with dark, tired eyes, spoke in a gravelly voice. "Where to?" he asked. Tom glanced at the address on his phone. "Just take me to Maple Street, please." The driver nodded without saying anything else. Tom slid into the back seat and leaned back against the worn upholstery. The cab smelled faintly of cigarettes and something else he couldn't place. The car pulled away, and for a few moments, everything seemed normal. The city's quiet hum surrounded them. The driver's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white. Tom wasn't paying much attention to him, lost in his own thoughts as the cab navigated the empty streets. But then, something strange happened. As they turned onto a side street, the car slowed down, almost to a crawl. Tom sat up, looking out the window. The neighborhood around him seemed unfamiliar, old houses with broken fences and boarded-up windows. He could have sworn they hadn't passed through this area before. "Are we taking a detour?" Tom asked, slightly uneasy. The driver didn't respond. He simply kept driving, his face expressionless. Tom tried again, a little louder this time. "Hey, this isn't the way to Maple Street. Are you lost?" Still, the driver didn't speak. The streets became narrower, darker. Tom looked around, feeling the unease grow. It was as if the city had disappeared, and they were driving through some forgotten part of town. The streetlights flickered as the cab passed under them, casting long, distorted shadows on the road. Something didn't feel right. Tom's pulse quickened. He glanced at the driver, but the man's eyes were fixed ahead, his face blank, as if he hadn't heard a word Tom had said. "Excuse me," Tom said, his voice firmer now, "I think you made a wrong turn. Can you pull over and let me out?" The car didn't slow. Instead, the driver took another sharp turn down an even darker, narrower street, and the headlights revealed a row of dilapidated houses with their windows covered in grime. The place felt abandoned, yet Tom felt the distinct sense that someone was watching him. His phone buzzed again. It was his wife. He quickly answered, trying to stay calm. "Hey, I'm on my way home, but I think we're lost or something. This doesn't feel right." He could hear her voice on the other end, but then, the line suddenly went dead. The call dropped. Tom checked his phone, but the signal was completely gone. Panic began to set in. He reached for the door handle, but to his horror, the door was locked. He tried the window, but it wouldn't budge either. "Let me out!" Tom shouted. "What the hell is going on?" The driver didn't even flinch. He didn't even acknowledge Tom's pleas. They kept driving deeper into the darkness, the buildings growing even more decayed, as if they were being swallowed by the night. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the cab came to a stop in front of a large, empty lot. The headlights illuminated a broken-down warehouse, its windows shattered and its doors hanging off their hinges. The driver turned off the engine, and the car went completely silent. Tom's heart raced. He didn't know what to do, but he knew he had to get out. "Let me out of the car," he screamed, his voice shaking with fear. The driver remained still. After a long, tense moment, he turned to look at Tom, his eyes cold and lifeless. "You're already here," he said, his voice soft but chilling. Tom's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? This isn't where I'm supposed to be. This isn't even Maple Street." The driver didn't respond. He simply pointed toward the warehouse, his finger rigid and accusing. Tom hesitated. His instincts screamed at him to get out, to run, but his legs felt like lead. Slowly, he opened the door. The cold air hit him immediately. He stepped out onto the pavement, his shoes scraping against the rough ground. The driver's voice echoed from behind him. "You never left." Tom turned, but the cab was already gone. The street was empty. There were no other cars. No people. Just the old, crumbling warehouse in front of him. He took a step forward, and then another, his eyes glued to the dark building. A flicker of movement caught his eye. For a split second, he thought he saw someone standing in the doorway of the warehouse, watching him. His breath caught in his throat. It was a man, but there was something wrong about him. The figure stood still, staring into the distance, unmoving. Tom's body screamed for him to turn and run, but he couldn't look away. "Come closer," the voice from behind him said, low and guttural. Tom's pulse raced as he turned, searching for the source of the voice. But there was no one. The street was completely empty again. The warehouse seemed to grow taller, more menacing, as if it was pulling him in. It wasn't until Tom turned back to the warehouse that he realized it wasn't just the man in the doorway who was watching him. The windows of the building were filled with faces, pale, gaunt, staring at him with hollow eyes. He backed away slowly, his mind screaming for him to run, to escape. But his feet wouldn't move. The faces in the windows grinned as he stared at them, their hollow eyes never blinking. And in that moment, Tom realized he had never truly left. He had been driving in circles, trapped in a place that didn't belong in the real world. His phone buzzed again, but when he looked at the screen, the call was from his wife. He answered in a panic, but the only sound that came through the line was the driver's voice. "You've always been here." And the line went dead. It was around 3 a.m. when Emily stepped out of the bar, the night air cool against her flushed skin. She had been celebrating her promotion at work, but the night had taken a strange turn. Most of her friends had already left, and the streets were eerily quiet as she walked down the block, looking for a taxi to take her home. She finally spotted one, a sleek black sedan parked by the curb. The cab's interior lights flickered as the driver lowered the window. He was a tall man, wearing a dark coat, his face shadowed under the brim of his hat. His eyes were hidden behind a pair of sunglasses, despite the late hour. "Where to?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "Just drop me off at Westbrook Avenue," Emily replied, not thinking much of it. She was tired and just wanted to get home. Without a word, the driver nodded, and Emily slid into the back seat. The moment the door clicked shut, she felt a strange chill, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. She shrugged it off, rolling the window down slightly to get some fresh air. The cab pulled away from the curb, and Emily watched the city pass by, the neon signs of the bars and restaurants casting a soft glow on the streets. But there was something unsettling about the way the city seemed to fade into the background, as if they were driving through a dream. The streets were unusually empty, no cars, no people. Just her and the driver. A few minutes into the ride, Emily glanced up at the rearview mirror. The driver's face was still hidden by the shadows of his hat, and his sunglasses reflected nothing but the dim lights of the street. It was almost as if he wasn't looking at the road at all, but rather at something in the distance. "Is everything okay?" Emily asked, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. The driver didn't respond. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles pale. Suddenly, the street lights flickered, then went out entirely. The darkness swallowed the car, and Emily's heart skipped a beat. She reached for her phone, but there was no signal. The usual hum of the city was gone. In its place, there was only an unsettling silence, broken only by the faint hum of the car's engine. "Where are we?" Emily asked, her voice trembling slightly. "This isn't the way to Westbrook Avenue." The driver didn't answer. He didn't even look in the rearview mirror. His face remained hidden in the shadows, and the car continued down the now empty street, the buildings around them growing more dilapidated, the sidewalks cracked and overgrown with weeds. Emily's sense of unease deepened. She reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't open. Panic surged through her. She tried the window, but it was stuck as well. Her breathing quickened as the car sped up, the headlights cutting through the thickening darkness. "Stop the car!" Emily shouted, her voice desperate. "I want to get out." The driver didn't respond. He simply continued driving, his focus unwavering. She could see his reflection in the rearview mirror now, but his face was still shrouded in darkness, his expression unreadable. The street ahead grew more twisted, more distorted. The buildings around them were decaying, their windows shattered, their doors hanging off their hinges. It felt like they had left the real world behind, like they were trapped in a forgotten part of the city, a place that didn't belong. "Please, I don't know where we are," Emily cried, her fear growing. "Stop the car." But just as she thought she would lose her mind, the car came to a screeching halt. The sudden stop threw her forward against the seatbelt, and she gasped, clutching her chest. She looked around frantically. They had stopped in front of an old, abandoned warehouse, its rusted doors hanging wide open, like an invitation to the unknown. The driver's voice, low and cold, broke the silence. "This is where you get off." Emily stared at him, her mind racing. "No," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't want to get out. I need to go home." The driver didn't move. He didn't even look at her. His grip on the wheel tightened. "You don't have a choice." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She had to get out, but the door was still locked. She slammed her fist against the window, trying to break it, but it wouldn't budge. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps as the panic began to set in. She felt trapped, suffocated by the oppressive silence of the night. Then, as if on cue, the headlights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Emily could hear nothing but her own frantic breathing. Her hands shook as she reached for the door handle again, but just before she could touch it, she felt something cold brush against her arm. She froze. The air around her grew colder, and for the first time, she noticed something strange. A shadow was moving in the back seat with her, dark, shifting, almost imperceptible. Emily tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow grew larger, closer, until it was almost beside her. Her pulse raced, and she struggled to push herself away from it, but it was as if the shadow was pulling her toward it, wrapping around her like cold fingers. The driver finally spoke, his voice like a whisper. "You shouldn't have taken this ride." Emily turned to look at him, but his face was no longer in the rearview mirror. Instead, she saw the shadow, no, not a shadow, but something far darker, far more sinister. It seemed to be growing, moving with a life of its own, wrapping around her like a suffocating fog. Before she could comprehend what was happening, the door unlocked. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the handle and threw open the door, stumbling out into the darkness. The moment her feet hit the pavement, the shadow seemed to vanish, dissipating into the night. Emily didn't look back. She ran as fast as she could, her heart pounding, her legs burning. The warehouse loomed behind her, dark and silent. She didn't stop until she reached a busy street, where the lights felt like a lifeline. As she looked back over her shoulder, there was nothing but the empty street. No cab. No driver. Just the quiet hum of the city, as if nothing had ever happened. But Emily would never forget the feeling of the unseen passenger beside her, the cold shadow that had ridden with her, waiting to claim her.